Let's go to Russia, it's only fair, to Moscow, to Nikolai Gorshkov, former director and editor at Sputnik News, and now an independent journalist. Nikolai.
Okay.
How do you assess the damage to Russia, to Europe, and even the United States as a result of this conflict?
Well, the damage is a double-edged sword. Of course, Russia is suffering, will probably suffer more because of all the sanctions imposed on her. But the counter-sanctions imposed by Russia would hurt the West as well. It's a no-win-win situation. Nobody's going to win. There might be hopes in the West that the West would persevere and prevail, but it's unlikely. First of all, the West is still being probably a dominant economic factor in the world. Still, it's not the only factor. There is China, there is India, there's Iran, there's Africa, there's Latin America. So the West is basically a small part of the world, of course, with huge potential, with a huge market and a lot of disposable income. But probably, and the Russians are saying this right now, probably it's the best opportunity the world has ever had since the collapse of the Soviet Union for a restructuring of the world's economy, so that more countries will come to the fore, and more countries will have freedom for their economies and for their trade, as opposed to right now when everybody is basically is dependent on the US market and the US dollar and the goodwill of the Federal Reserve System and the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund.
You're in Moscow. How are the people coping with this crisis? How many agree? How many disagree?
Well, obviously, there is a split in the Russian public opinion. I'd say that a minority of people who, would be usually called as the chattering classes, the so-called intelligentsia or the liberal class, they, of course, are not happy. Some people have already left the country. Others have spoken against this military operation. Others are complaining about lack of Parmesan cheese, or other Western goodies, although still they are available. But of course, the sanctions are not something new. The sanctions had been introduced back in a lot of them in 2014, but even before that, there were certain restrictions. But the majority of people, they're used to being in some kind of isolation or feeling like being a besieged fortress from their previous experiences, or simply not understanding why the West is doing to us because we haven't done anything different from the West. When the West thought it was appropriate to protect the people, say, of Bosnia or of Kosovo or anywhere else, they would go in with a lot of bombers, and rocket fire and shelling and everything would be fine from a Western point of view. Now we are trying to save our brothers across the border in Ukraine, and all of a sudden the West is against this. They're actually helping those who had been abusing the people in Donbass, for example. So basically the general mood for now is that it'll end up soon. Let us finish our job in Ukraine.
Did you anticipate this level of escalation, both by Russia and by NATO in response?
Well, to a Russian, it didn't come as a surprise, because for a Russian, they all knew what was going on for 8 years since 2014 in East Ukraine. They knew there was civil strife. They knew that the new Ukrainian state after the coup in February 2014, they came down like a ton of bricks on the people in the East. If Russia ever interfered in that conflict back in 2014, it was because Russia felt responsible for protecting people in East Ukraine against the aggression by the state from Kiev. That was the issue. It was not very much different from what the West was accusing Belgrade of in Kosovo. When Kosovars started protesting, Serbian police started trying to put it down, And of course, Serbian police was blamed for all the brutality. And then Belgrade was bombed for what, 78 days. So we're in early days in Ukraine right now. But if NATO followed their own logic from Kosovo, they should be bombing Kiev right now.
Do you think we're headed into a Cold War even colder than the last one?
Well, God forbid we're heading towards a hot war, a bigger hot war. I'm not entirely optimistic, because you have to understand, when President Putin says that we and the Ukrainians are one people, you may also interpret this as the Ukrainians are as hardy fighters as we are. So in a way, in a lot of people's minds, this is not really a war between Russia and Ukraine. In a way, it's a fratricidal war. It is a civil war.
What do you say to those that theorize that this has all been a trap for Russia and that Putin has fallen into it, and that the European Union and the NATO countries, never particularly united these last years, are now united as never before?
Well, the general line of thinking in Russia is that, yes, it was provoked by the West, but not necessarily because they wanted to reintegrate or reunite. The understanding is that the real big target for the West, especially for the United States, is China. Now, if China, in its future conflict, a lot of people believe is inevitable with the United States, if China has a backup in the face of Russia's energy, Russia's military power or whatever, because the first thing the United States would do if there's a conflict between them and China, they would cut off Chinese maritime supply routes. So the only supply route to China, if there is a conflict with the United States, would be from Siberia. Hence, the power of Siberia gas pipeline, for example. There are oil pipelines as well. They are not being used right now, but a lot of people suspect these pipelines had been built, actually, in the case of a major war between China and the United States. So the people are thinking that if Russia is undermined and weakened, China would be next. And when they hear, for example, that some Chinese companies are following or abiding by the sanctions, and there are some Chinese companies who are abiding by Western sanctions, people in Russia are saying, this is not clever, because once they get rid of us, they would go after China. So China must be aware of that.